do not give the figure. Then secondly, they keep arresting and releasing people. But
That's
I've
right.
now seen a figure which is close to 4,000.
That's right.
1,900 something. That might be credible, we don't know. But I'm particularly happy today, with this gathering, and this is to really give ourselves a big cheer up because, some of us are tired of listening about Myanmar by people who have not even, spent a day in Myanmar, who probably have not even entered Myanmar. Especially people who have been living in far off places such as Europe and so on. That's why today we have very select panelists who are going to talk about the subject that they know.
So in that case, at least I have put my foot into Myanmar for the 7 days I was permitted. So I'm hopefully allowed to see something.
Indeed. No. You and Manjeet are exceptions because as institutional leaders, you have to do a variety of things. But there would be no excuse if we gathered together people, who had only very limited bookish knowledge, which is not the case at all. Yeah. So we are coming close to the time, Ali. I think this is wonderful that our panelists are so disciplined. They are all in time, and we will try to reciprocate.
Yeah. We'll have a little bit of, people will start floating in.
Yeah, let them join, and we all know our role. And I think
good evening, everybody.
Pankaj, welcome. How nice to see you, and thank you very much for joining and supporting us as always.
Sure,
Pankaj
sir.
is the number 2 in caste in India. You are seeing the panelists, Kavi and Patricia and Dr. Minzin.
So just to let everybody know, we also have the streaming live on YouTube. And so there will be people who will be watching on YouTube. And also, typically, we find that even if people can't come in at this time, they go back and they rewatch it. So we usually have very good feedback in the course of sort of a week or two. No, Blaze wanted to come in. I don't know whether he's got a problem. Let's check. Okay. Should we start or give one more minute, Rajiv?
Yeah.
Maybe one more minute, and then we'll start.
Absolutely.
So just to let everybody know what the drill is, we will go through the. I will just open it. Peter will give the welcoming remarks, and then Rajiv will take over, and we'll have a conversation about 40 minutes with all of you, and then open it up for audience Q&A, which Rajiv or I will monitor. If Rajiv has a problem with his internet, I will step right in, so it'll be seamless, and don't worry. And then after that, we'll close it down. We'll just give you all, maybe Rajiv will give you a few minutes to wrap up, and then we will send you our outcome documents when it's all done.
And Samir at the end will do the.
And Samir will give. Samir, you're giving the closing, right? Samir will give the closing remarks. Yeah. So please meet Samir Patil. Samir is our national security fellow. And he does maritime, national security, terrorism, cybersecurity, and now even sanctions. And we have a lot to say on sanctions. So I think we can start, Rajiv, no?
Yes.
5:31. I think let's start because people will start. Okay. Ali, we're ready to go. Good evening, everybody. This is Manjeet Kripalani. I'm the Executive Director of Gateway House, the Indian Council on Global Relations in Mumbai. We welcome you very warmly to the KAS Gateway House, 8th KAS Gateway House webcast. And today we have a webcast of a matter on a country that is very, very dear to our hearts and very close to India's strategic interest, and that is Myanmar. We all know that there has been a coup in Myanmar. It is now May 11th is 100 days of the coup in Myanmar. And to discuss this we have a fantastic panel. It is a panel of our neighbors, all of whom have a very close interest in Myanmar and a close interest in seeing Myanmar succeed. We also have someone from Myanmar, which is also unusual in these days. So I'm going to quickly run it by. We have Professor Kavi Chongkitavon, who is at Chulalongkorn University. Dr. Kavi, welcome. We have Dr. Min Zin, who is at the Institute for Strategic, sorry, just bear with me a minute, studies in Myanmar, and he is currently watching the situation very closely. Executive Director, Institute for Strategy and Policy. And then we have Patricia Mukhin, who is the editor of the Shillong Times. Many of you will be familiar with her work. Patricia is following Myanmar from the Northeast, which is a sister of Myanmar almost. And so the moderator is going to be Dr. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. Rajiv will take everybody through the session. It will be about 40 minutes, followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A. We request all of you to put your phones on mute. The audience Q&A will be conducted via the chat. So please put all your questions on the chat that Rajiv or I will take. You can identify yourself or not, as you wish. And before we move on to Rajiv, I request Peter Ramel, who is the head of KAS in India, to say a few words. Peter is a lover of Asia and all the good things that Asia stands for. So Peter, over to you. And before we go, Samir Patil, my colleague who's a National Security Fellow at Gateway House, will give the closing remarks. Peter.
Esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, dear Manjeet, dear Ranjit, it has been 100 days, exactly 102 days since the military coup in Myanmar. 102 days in which the civilian population in Myanmar has been subjected to violence on almost unfathomable scale. 102 days in which they had to suffer extensive human rights violations. 102 days of being subjected to a military authoritarian regime. For large parts of the international community, this period marked now almost 4 months of condemnations, sanctions, and continued diplomatic consultations. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres promised in an emotional speech that the United Nations would do everything in its power to unite the international community and create conditions to reverse the military coup in Myanmar. But as quickly as the condemnations were pronounced, Beijing vetoed them in the UN Security Council, and the people of Myanmar were left standing by themselves against the authoritarian military junta. But the youth is demonstrating for democracy. With their prospects vanishing before their eyes, hundreds of thousands of people of all ages and backgrounds have been marking the onset of a civil disobedience movement that fights against the military junta and for democracy. Now, specifically for Indians, of course, if they hear civil disobedience, it connects immediately with Gandhi and also what can be achieved with the disobedience movement as it was at times. So many of the people in Myanmar are very young, and they have benefited from their country's fragile democratic transition over the past decade. They know that the return of the military to power will undo hard-won gains in economic and social development and basic freedoms. The future of generations is at stake. For some of them, this future will unfortunately never arrive. As per data provided by the NGO Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, over 300 of them have already lost their lives. Over 2,000 were arrested, of whom countless were tortured in custody. Even today, as we hold this virtual event, lives and futures are being lost in Myanmar. At the same time, history offers a stark reminder of what the youth is likely to face if they don't fight back. In 1950, Myanmar's per capita income was higher than that of Malaysia or Thailand. But the following decades of closed-door policies of the junta rulers resulted in severe underinvestment in the economy and public goods, as well as services with deep and corrosive effects on human capital. Military rule turned Myanmar from one of the most promising economies in Asia into one of its worst performers. Young Myanmar doesn't want the clock turned back. That said, ladies and gentlemen, we as members of the international community cannot simply turn a blind eye to the horrific images we see daily in the news about Myanmar, but must find concrete solutions to implement the core objectives of the UN in Myanmar, which are namely respect for democratic ethics, international law, human rights, and peace. The present event provides us with an excellent opportunity to discuss these solutions. Now, what was the international response? In short, of course, there were international condemnations by various nations. There was a plan to have the blocking collective sanctions of the UN, but they were blocked in the Security Council by China and Russia. That leads to the second instrument, that's the international community reacting with sanctions. There was a strong response by EU, US, UK, other countries. But there is also a comment to be remembered of Myanmar, and that is that a general in Myanmar just said, it was Aung. He ignored all the consensus, what was achieved by ASEAN, and also said more or less in clear words that Myanmar was used to sanctions and it doesn't really bother them because they will find other states supporting them. Maybe that's the situation in short. What is the conclusion out of that? As the resident representative of CAS to India, a foundation that stands firmly for the principle of democracy, it grieves me deeply to witness the events in Myanmar, a country that seemed to be slowly but steadily moving along the path to a promising democratic future, and its events like the present one that assume even more importance, as they will certainly provide food for thought on concrete solutions for the Myanmar crisis and the fostering of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me wind up with a quote from the journalist Anne O'Hare McCormick, who stated, "Today, the real test of power is not capacity to make war, but capacity to prevent it." Unfortunately, the international community has failed to prevent the military coup. It's now for us, maybe, to be part of the force of peace and work collectively together to prevent Myanmar from plunging into an abyss of horrific humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for those excellent opening remarks. Our distinguished audience, I would like to first of all welcome all of you. I know that this is...
Rajiv, I think we're having a little bit of a problem hearing you. Can you hear Rajiv?
No? Can you hear me?
I can hear him, but just slow
Rajiv,
voice.
I think yeah, it's very soft. Is there some way of increasing the...
I will try to speak a bit loudly. Can you hear me better now?
No, there's something with the...
Remute it. And is it better now? Can we hear it?
Very slightly better. Can you speak into the mic, Rajiv?
Yeah. All right. So let me start with the first question so that other panelists have the chance to speak. I will go for the first question with Dr. Myint. We are really privileged that you are taking part in this discussion because you are from Myanmar and it's wonderful to hear Myanmar's voice on the situation in the country. My very first question to you, sir, is whether this coup resulted from a fundamental difference with regard to the elections. One party thought they were fair and the other party thought that they were fraudulent. Or is it something much deeper than just the divergences on the elections? So kindly help us to understand the genesis of this coup. Thank you.
Thank you, the ambassador, and also thank you for having me to take part in this wonderful opportunity. I think there's an underlying tension between the military and the NLD, National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. That underlying tension between these two is somehow, leading toward the coup. So the coup in February reflected the fundamental civil-military relation problem in Myanmar. We all know the Myanmar military control or misrule the country for nearly 5 decades, and also like they through the constitutional means, they enshrine a lot of prerogative, including constitutional veto. So in Myanmar, if you want to amend major constitutional changes, you need to get more than 75% of vote in the parliament. But in the parliament, Myanmar military got the result. Basically, reach more than 75%, you cannot change the constitution. So in this way, the Myanmar military control the constitutional veto. So there are like fundamental tension, between NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi and the Myanmar military with regard to constitutional amendment, constitutional reform process, and then the possibility. But at the same time, the Myanmar military, even though they got all these prerogative and privileges in the constitution and also in the economy and in the society, they still could not contain Aung San Suu Kyi's popularity. Let alone push her back. So that's why this coup is somehow to do with the military wanted to revise their veto power, wanted to expand their veto power. They found it what they already achieved in the very, very rigid constitution, enshrine military prerogative is not enough. That's why they needed to expand it. That's the main reason, underlying reason. But the military used the vote fraud as a triggering reason to stage coup. But it does not mean the election in 2020 was a flawless. There was some questionable problem. In a way, even the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi maximized their incumbent advantages somehow to marginalize ethnic minorities and religious minority to get the equal playing field in the election. So on the one hand, yeah, military was brutal and very much greedy, but on the other hand, the supposedly the reform, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi failed to meet up the standard that we Democrats expect them to do. So in a way, that the election has some issues. So back to your question. Yeah,
thank you. Thank you very much.
The underlying civil-military relation problem.
So as I understand, obviously both factors were there, but you are very clearly stressing the role of the political dynamics between the two camps. Thank you. Kavi, let me come to you. We are really happy that you are here. You are a close and long time observer of Myanmar from Thailand, and you ensure that the Thai voice and the Asian voice is heard and understood here. I want to ask you a slightly, a variation on the previous question. Do you feel this rift between the two camps was inevitable? Do you feel that Thailand, which watches this closely, was not surprised? And do you also feel that the high costs which now are being incurred by the people of Myanmar, were they foreseen to some extent at all or no? Unmute, please, yourself. Unmute yourself.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Rajiv. You asked me very important questions, 3 questions. It will take me 3 days to answer. Indeed.
Well, yes, but
I will make it short, because I think
yeah.
has give you a very good answer. One of the most important elements in Myanmar is the coexisting between the Tatmadaw and political leader. In this sense, you have the daughters of independent leaders, General Aung San. So it's make it rather what you call, it can be very difficult and it can be also easy. If you notice that for at least a decade, the military's leaders and the civilian leaders, they were able to coexist. Of course, there are a lot of tensions. And in the last 5 years, NLD, particularly Aung San Suu Kyi, has more confidence. She's really can gain much more public support. She even went to the World Court, defends the military, but she's a nationalist. But when it comes to local controls, I think there's a big difference, particularly on the style of the 2 leaders. In Thailand, you have civilian leaders and the military leaders working together. They may not see eye to eye, but they're working together. They sometimes they have to compromise. But in the case of Myanmar, I think the failure is that in this case, I think both sides are confident that they can live without the other sides. I think that's the wrong move. I think Aung San Suu Kyi, in the last election, because of her victory, landslide, she has the confidence that she might not need the support of the Tatmadaw as before. And that creates a kind of tension or diminish the role, traditional roles of Tatmadaw in the history of Myanmar. I mean, it's the DNA of Myanmar, I have to say that. So this kind of chemistry between the leader is actually, from my point of view, from the Thai experience, is a big factor. You don't have leaders who get along between civilian, military, which Min Sen touched upon. For me, I even go a little bit further that Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing, if they were able to strike a compromise a little bit, for example, from the Thai point of view, when there were allegations of electoral fraud and some what the Tatmadaw alleged of the water lease fraud, I think in the case of Thailand, we will set up a committees saying that we will investigate. I would say that it's a strategy to buy time. But on the 26th, 27th of January, we thought that there was some agreement, some compromise, and that is why everybody was so relieved. But then suddenly, the coup came so surprisingly for us. So I think the dynamic between the civilian leader and Tatmadaw in Myanmar, no matter what, from now on, is even more important as both sides are preparing for dialogue and reconciliation process. So in a way, from the Thai point of view, we were very happy for the past 10 years. That is why we have developed a very good relation with both Aung San Suu Kyi and also Tatmadaw. We have good friends just like India and also in case of China, because all these 3 countries felt very good. They want to support that Myanmar that is stable and part of ASEAN community. Ambassador Patil.
Thank you very much. So briefly and so succinctly, you have presented the differences of perspective between Thailand and Myanmar. I think this is very refreshing. Thank you very much. Patricia, let me come to you. Among us all Indians, you have a vantage position to watch and interpret Myanmar. You are a premier editor of a premier newspaper sitting in Shillong. You have seen a refugee coming into Mizoram and Manipur. They probably still are coming in small numbers. Do you think the government of India was right in discouraging Myanmar people to seek shelter in the Northeast? But feel free also to tell us a bit more about the special relationship between the northeastern region of India and Myanmar in the current context.
See, looking from the Northeast, one is unable to understand the diplomatic strategies being currently deployed by India. In fact, in the midst of all the terror that was being unleashed by the junta, it was quite amazing to see India, along with 8 other countries, participating in the military parade of that country in March this year, March 27 to be precise, which is the Myanmar Armed Forces Day. What was this supposed to signify? That India too relies heavily on its military might, like Pakistan or Russia or China, which are not exactly poster boys of democracy. It would appear to us as onlookers that New Delhi is adopting a middle path and engaging with the Tatmadaw as a strategic ally, at the same time calling for the restoration of democracy in the country. Is this going to work? Or is this weakening India's stand as a champion of democracy? Ironically, in August 2018, India and Myanmar had activated the free movement regime for people residing in villages on both sides of that 1643-kilometer border. And this border is a 32-kilometer band, 16 kilometers on each side, which passes, of course, through very harsh terrain and sometimes through plain land, through water bodies, rivers. And this is because of the genuine cultural and economic ties that villagers on both sides share. There's so many stories of people coming in from Myanmar to Manipur, to those Naga villages of Manipur, to buy their supplies, staying there for a week, and then going back. It's a very, very close economic and cultural tie and social tie. And we have to face certain facts that international boundaries draw in and draw out people of the same ethnic and kinship ties. If one visits Mizoram, it is common to see families having domestic help that are of the Zo, Kuki, Chin origin coming in from Myanmar. Nearly every family has one. With or without the free movement regime, there's a constant flow of people who come in, as I said earlier, to buy supplies, to visit kin, to come in even for medical help, medical aid, because they don't have medical services in that region of Myanmar. As far as allowing refugees to come in because they're suffering persecution, I think it's a question of whether India still believes in human rights, in the human rights of refugees, being a signatory of that UN instrument. Of course, one also has to agree that there is a limit to how many refugees a country can take, so that there's a fine balance between humanitarian concerns and pragmatism. But of course, that is a double-edged sword because it involves economic resources. And the deeper question here is whether India can afford to add to its existing population when the pandemic has taken away so many jobs. And we are in for a very, very bad time after we get over this phase of ours. As of now, officially, of course, there are about 700 refugees, some in Manipur and some in Mizoram. We are not very sure about the numbers, but numbers are always lying. The free movement regime has been closed since March 2020 on account of the pandemic. But we also know that this is, this outlet is also a drug trade zone. It's an arms trade zone. And it can sometimes lead to spurts in refugee movements, which can all threaten to disturb the peace in this region. Also, that insurgents move in and out as they wish to. So if you ask me about the refugees, it's hard to say yes or no. The people of Mizoram feel they are our flesh and blood, and they were very concerned, so concerned that they wrote to the Prime Minister that they should be allowed to come.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Patricia. You brought forth the very complicated factors which are all involved here. I'll make a quick follow-up question to Kavi on this briefly. Thailand is suffering from the same issue of refugees coming in from Myanmar, and probably, in fact, the influx is much bigger, and with the prospects of armed conflict between the military and ethnic armed organizations, this could even become more serious. Very briefly, how are you looking and handling the refugee problem or influx in Thailand, Kavi? Unmute yourself, please.
This is a very sensitive issue because it's involved in the Thai-Myanmar border security situation. As you know, Thailand has 2,400 kilometers borders with Myanmar. And as you correctly point out in the questions, the guide saying that Thailand now have nearly 100,000 displaced persons from 34 years ago. They still live inside Thai territory along the Naypyidaw camp. So it's very difficult for Thailand to receive more the so-called person fleeing conflicts. But if they actually come, as it did in the past 3-4 weeks, several thousand, but when the situation was calmer, they will return because of the border. They know each other, they cross back and forth. But at the moment, in anticipation of fighting between armed ethnic groups and the Tatmadaw, Thailand has been worked out contingency plan with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, so that if there is a great influx, there will be some assistance in places. At the moment, Thailand can handle it because it's small scale. And you have to also aware of the border situation, because at the moment, there were large number of influx of illegal migrants who escaped COVID-19 pandemic from Myanmar side, cross over to Thailand. So, and Thailand now is suffering from surge of the third wave, very, very high. Just like today, we have more than 4,000 infection. So that's a very high, one of the highest in the past 3 weeks. So this is the situation. And the Thai hope that there should be no fighting, at least try to make sure that freeing refugees would be able to contain.
Thank you very much, Kavi. I gave sufficient time to rest to Dr. Myint for a special reason. I have one of the most meaty questions for him at this stage. Could you help us to interpret the actual reactions and the way, the West, the UN, China, Russia, and even ASEAN have looked at this crisis? I know it's a very large, tall order, but I know that you are such a disciplined person that you would help us to understand, keeping in mind that the audience has done a lot of reading research on their own as well. So how has the world looked at this crisis, and how are they trying to relate to resolve it?
I think that in terms of condemnation, it's quite strong. In some cases, unprecedented. Especially United Nations Security Council was quite tough. But in terms of coordinated action and mechanism, which is very disappointing, I think the international community seemed to delegating this job to ASEAN, which is quite tricky, because ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is also important, but at the same time, because of its own internal unity is pretty weak, and because of its own capacity is still weak. That's why it seemed like when you delegate ASEAN to do these things, it seemed like you're given a veneer of doing something, actually you are not doing something significant that make the situation get resolved. I mean, so that's a major problem. In this case, I think the Western countries do not have much leverages except increasing, economic sanctions and other targeted sanctions, which Burmese military is somehow stubbornly resilient and kind of like to be get away with in many cases. But at the same time, I think the role of China together with Russia is quite crucial in giving life-saving backup to the Myanmar military. I think it's that's why like Chinese and Russia together block any UNSC the measurements such as arms embargo on Myanmar, the China and Russia are blocking. So to me, I think one of the key issues is United States. United States has the grandiose plan, which we call it Indo-Pacific strategy. But the question is, there are two main pillars. One is Quad. India is part of it. And another one is ASEAN. But the problem is, Myanmar is a part of the ASEAN. ASEAN usually work in the consensus, based decision making. So long as Myanmar is part of ASEAN, how come United States can sit down together with the ASEAN as a bloc to advance cooperation with regard to Indo-Pacific and other important strategies? I think that's very important, because it used to be in 2005, 2006, United States did not join ASEAN multilateral engagement because of Myanmar was part of it. At that time, Myanmar even skipped ASEAN chairmanship, I think, in 2006. So right now, we are back to the square one, the situation. So whether the United States is willing to sacrifice bigger goal, which is Indo-Pacific, because of they allow Myanmar to hijack the whole thing. So to me, the last point is, it's so important for all of us to acknowledge the Myanmar before the coup and after coups are totally different. What Myanmar military has been doing is violations of all human decency. When you pick up like UN Charter or ASEAN Charter, any values, any norms, they are violating. So we need to be very careful not to frame Myanmar issue as a Chinese versus United States geopolitical rivalry. If people think they are so smart to see Myanmar issue only in terms of China versus United States, we will definitely make a big disservice to the Myanmar people who sacrifice their life in the streets.
Thank you very much. Let me come to Patricia before coming to Kavi very quickly, because our time is running out for this particular segment. Patricia, you have presented a perspective, very balanced perspective, if I may say, from Northeastern region, the political and the human rights. We have a lot of people in this audience who are from the business community in India and outside. We know that, all of us worked very hard to motivate Indian business to go into Myanmar in the past 10 years. Not all of them were totally enthusiastic. They were reluctant, but they slowly went and they started flourishing. Now this current crisis must have come as a blow, as a disappointment to them. So how do you feel from your vantage position, India should really tackle the situation whereby, human rights situation is protected, the refugees thing is protected, the business interests are protected as well. Do you have some advice, some suggestion for the government and for business community?
See, there are so many views depending on which side of the divide people are on. There are some policy analysts who believe India should continue to stick to its policy of engaging with the Tatmadaw, at the same time demand for the restoration of democracy. But this is unlikely to work. I think we have to take a firmer stand. And I do not know the the nitty-gritty, the intricacies of India's engagement with the Tatmadaw, except for the fact that they have helped India to contain the Northeast insurgents, and for which India is perhaps, very grateful for that. But I would like to think that India's policy in the past towards Myanmar was much more firm. If we recall when Aung San Suu Kyi was put, into detention about 3 decades ago, at that time India stood firm and said that we demand that democracy is restored in Myanmar. Then what happened was that China came in and became aligned with the Tatmadaw, got an entry into the country, and got an entry point into South Asia to make it a sort of a leader there. And it would seem to be that India lost out because it believed in democratic tenets. So if India's strategy right now is to counter Chinese influence over South Asia and the Indo-Pacific, then maybe it needs to strategize differently. And with the pandemic happening now, I don't know how the pandemic is affecting Myanmar, because we don't hear anything about that so much. But the way we are being affected now, if we do not get our act together and and take this as an opportunity for our own economic development to the entire Southeastern Asian region, then we are creating much more hurdles even for ourselves in the northeastern part of India, because we were actually progressing on trade, on tourism, on health tourism, for instance. There were a lot of people coming into the hospitals in Manipur for treatment. But then again, because of security reasons, that was disbanded shortly. So I believe that we need to have a very clear policy ourselves. The policy that dictates us should, like somebody had, I think Min Myint had said just now, if we are going to link China to, put China as a key stakeholder in every of our discussions, then we might miss, the wood for the trees. I think we need to be clear on our own game plan.
Patricia, thank you very much. One day I would love to debate this thing with you, but not today. The question that comes to my mind is, when situation is not clear, when the situation is complicated,
yes,
when the situation is multidimensional, how do you have a clear policy?
Yeah.
But that would be for another day. I have lastly a question once again with economic orientation, and this is meant for both the panelists. I'll first request Dr. Min Myint and then Kavi. We know that foreign investment is suffering badly in Myanmar. Telenor has just booked losses of about $800 million in the very first quarter. Its share price is going down. We are aware of long lines in front of the banks. People are not getting their money. We know that people are not going to the offices to work. So you have a very sad dilemma for Myanmar. The fight for full democracy means almost certain economic ruin. Whereas if everybody agrees to go back to hybrid or limited democracy, then there is economic stability and perhaps modest prosperity. Dr. Min Myint, how do you look at the economic dimension of this crisis, and what do you suggest Myanmar people need to do? Because you would agree that the problem has emanated from that soil and the solution also must come from that soil.
We all know the World Bank made a prediction that Myanmar economy will be in the big contraction, like 10% of contraction. And then even on the ground, you can go see the people of Myanmar lining up outside ATM machine for days after days, not just one day, to get their money back from the bank, very limited amount of money. So I think the banking crisis, the people trust in the economy, and then all these FDI fleeing the country, the daily things. And at the same time, not only economic collapse, but also the humanitarian crisis. You know, World Food, the United Nations World Food Program already warned, 3.4 million or so people will go starving this year. And then we have the UNDP data on that, the large majority of people will go under poverty line. So I think this is a serious, especially I'm a bit more worried about the healthcare situation, because many of the doctors and nurses are joining civil disobedience movement, basically boycott against the regime. So the Myanmar healthcare system has been already like fragile. It's now like almost collapsed. So I think if you had that the COVID-19 third wave or any other type of the healthcare problem, because Myanmar, because of this healthcare issues, I think the infant inoculation is being like stalled in Myanmar. So I think if we had that healthcare situation, I think humanitarian crisis will be like big issue in Myanmar. But it seemed like both sides, the general public and the coup maker, they still perceive they haven't reached a stalemate. They still feel like they can pursue a strategy to prevail over another. So I think that the Myanmar people are such a like strong, resilient, and also somehow very unprecedented anger against the military. So I think they are more radicalized. So to me, I'm more worried that the rule of law is already gone, but the most security crisis and humanitarian crisis that we have been seeing along the ethnic area and border area will taking place in central Burma or lowland Myanmar area. That's what we are now seeing in some places of Myanmar in the lowland area.
So each side still feels that it can prevail over the other.
Let me use a stalemate. I don't feel like the mutually hunting stalemate, right?
Yeah,
So
it looks different. Kavi, would you kindly also respond to the question, the economic orientation?
Well, luckily, the border trades continue between Thailand and Myanmar. In fact, border trade has increased during the first quarter. And as Min Sin said, the financial situation is very bad. People waiting ATM, but there are people who carry fresh cash from Thailand across the border every day. So I think the economic free fall will impact on the Myanmar society, because in the past 10 years, Myanmar tried to give a new orientation from the much government's socialist centralized control into a free market economy, but it has not yet been successful. Now, as a community of ASEAN, is very important. That is why I bet on the hope that ASEAN will move quickly now to have somebody on the ground to assess the situation so that humanitarian can be assessed and given firsthand. I'd like to build on a little bit on Vincent. Why major power trust ability of ASEAN to handle this issue, even though ASEAN structurally is very powerless, but because of its weaknesses, it's also considered strange. Why? ASEAN has convening power. If you have ASEAN engaged in Myanmar, other major power will wait and help in the second tier. Now the first tier, I heard that ASEAN's chair will send its foreign minister Erdogan's Yusuf and Secretary General to Myanmar. I don't know, after Ramadan, which is have to be the next few days. Then I think you will see some progress. It's slow and it takes time because ASEAN need consensus. But one thing about ASEAN, if it commit to any issue, it cannot retract, it cannot withdraw. It has to move on until they find a sustainable solution.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very fair point. Dear friends, at this stage, I want to involve the audience because they are very heavily interested and engaged. I have a question from Pankaj Madan from CAS. This is, I'm going to read this and I think we can request Dr. Myint to respond to this. is Myanmar the latest addition to the emerging second pole of the world, which is being led by China, and with Russia playing the second fiddle? Dr. Minzin, please unmute yourself.
It's very important to understand the Myanmar Tatmadaw, the military, as well as the Myanmar people. There's a strong deposit of anti-Chinese sentiment, not only in the Myanmar general population, but also within the Tatmadaw. One of the main reasons the Tatmadaw undertook the political transition in 2010-11 was they wanted to stay away or diversify, not only to rely on China, but also broaden their scope, their outreach to India, Russia, and the Western countries. So I think the unfortunate thing was the failure of elite, not only Tatmadaw leadership, but also Aung San Suu Kyi, to reach the multiple equilibriums of negotiation, to transform this, like the hybrid regime into more consolidation of democracy. So to me, I think if the international community coordinate well to restore some kind of mutually acceptable solution in Myanmar, I think that we cannot assume that Myanmar will become a client of another client of China. I think that Myanmar people has some kind of, is it good or bad, some kind of strong nationalistic attitude to what the foreigners may be part of our colonial experience. But to me, I don't think it would be too premature to say that Myanmar will become like another client of China. But at the same time, structurally, if the situation keep on going like that, structurally, it will be very difficult for us to resist the Chinese influence because of all the ethnic conflict.
Thank you, Dr. Minzin. I can testify on the basis of my years of work in that country that yes, your country is indeed very nationalistic. And this is where a lot of people outside Myanmar are unable to understand its national temperament. The only thing is Myanmar will exercise an option provided it does not run out of options entirely. Kavi, I'm coming to you. With a question which will be very much relevant here, and I was bringing this question to you. There is a question from Shantanu Roy Chaudhary, the young scholar. He's asking, can we expect to see an increasing and more active Chinese role in Myanmar? Or unless their interests are directly threatened, are they willing to wait and watch?
Right,
Kavi?
very good question. I think China now is waiting. They would like to see ASEANs as the first tier of actors. Now they're watching. No surprise, China was the first country to come out and support ASEAN Leaders Summit, was the first country within less than 24 hours. So at the moment, ASEAN engagement with Myanmar military junta is good for China. I think China will become more assertive if ASEAN fail. And if ASEAN fail in the sense that Chinese engagement will be based on China core interests inside Myanmar. I think that's the one important point. I want to also allude to the role of Russia. Russia maybe has a special role in Myanmar, but not in country in ASEAN, because after years and years of engagement with ASEAN, Russia still has difficulty in engaging individual ASEAN country. So that is one of the dilemma when Russia wants to approach ASEAN. So when you talk about China, Russia in the context of Southeast Asia, you have to make distinction because Russia in Myanmar is a very special case. No other country had that kind of relation, except if you want to refer to during the former Soviet Union era, the Vietnam, Laos, and also Cambodia, but now they are under the influence of China.
Right. Thank you very much, Kavi. Appreciate that. I have two questions, brief, quick questions. One is from Manjeet, and I think for this I have to go to Dr. Minzen. The Myanmar generals love their homes, and they're not interested in living in exile in Macau or Paris or anywhere else. Is this correct? And what are the implications of this perception? Dr. Minzen, please unmute.
Actually, I cannot generalize, this type of statement. But as far as I know, the Myanmar generals are very much inward-looking, and then they have that very idiosyncratic, ideology that they think of themselves as a guardian not only of the society but also of the religion. So I then like this type of like complicated, complex, the political culture, which is somehow feudal, but somehow also very the patriotic militarism. So I think this is very complex thing. So I think this is somehow not only military as a foreign body, it's a part of the Myanmar society. So I think like we have to be very careful in terms of our expectation. Of course, when you have that revolutionary movement, right? Of course, people like transform themselves, their identity has been changed, their life has been changed. But when you have that moment of like things are slowing down, people are back to their default. When you look at the Rohingya crisis, the whole country rallied behind Naypyidaw and Aung San Suu Kyi because they think this is the national sovereignty issue. So I think it's not that easy black and white, but of course, this is a good opportunity for all of us, to promote more tolerance, more liberal values of the society. But with regard to Myanmar general, they are more or less inward looking, and they think of themselves very highly, and then they think of themselves indispensable.
So you would perhaps agree that without adding any value judgment, we have to recognize that the military in Myanmar has played a pivotal role right from the beginning. It is the government, it is the civil service, it is the army defending the country, it is the player playing the role in development, it's the player playing the role in diplomacy. So you have to recognize that fact, and I think you have brought that out very, very clearly. Let me quickly go to Patricia. This is just for you, Madam, the question coming from Dr. Aditya Bhan. Is it wise to accept more refugees, especially in this pandemic situation, given that monitoring their movement in India is practically impossible? Unmute yourself, Patricia, please. Patricia, unmute, please. Yeah.
It's a very difficult question to answer, because if you're looking at the Mizo people, they feel that these are their kith and kin, and they deserve to be protected from the persecution that they're undergoing at the moment. And that is on the one hand. On the other hand, the COVID cases in Mizoram are just going up. They're spiraling. They've reached 7,000 yesterday, 7,000 plus. So for Mizoram, it's a tall order. They really don't know what decisions to make. I think the government of India somehow has not, tried to meddle in that affair any longer. They're very quiet about it now. But monitoring people's movements is anyway very difficult. Even the movement of people within, from Bangladesh to India and vice versa. Borders are very porous, and no matter what you do, you can never really shut down borders between neighbors that have been, so to say, one nation, pre-colonial. So that is my answer. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a difficult question, and it again does not accept a direct answer, so to say. I think I can understand that. There's a question, another interesting question. I think I'll go to Dr. Minzen. This is coming from Marini Schaefer. She's asking, how should the international community proceed in order to provide a proper mediation process in Myanmar? Should the military junta be given a backdoor to step down without losing face? Just a quick comment. You can unmute yourself, Dr. Myint. We are looking at this divergence that on the one hand, UN should take full charge and not delegate it to ASEAN. On the other hand, as Kavi said, ASEAN is a local body. It should have a pivotal role. So keeping that divergent perception in mind, kindly answer this question.
To me, for the time being, the Myanmar, both sides of Myanmar, like Tambador as well as the general public are not ready to accept any type of mediation. As I said, they perceive both are winning. They are winning. So I think that right now, what we could do is only pre-mediation stuff, which is basically to have the communication, playing the interlocuting role between the government, the parallel government and the military. So that type of thing might, and then especially we need to reshape the crisis. The crisis is now being seen as a zero-sum. The military think they can crack down and then they can resume their own roadmap and new election. The opposition, the general public view, they can still win and they can remove the military regime change. I think that what we need now is we need to reframe the crisis from zero-sum to more like conflict transformation. In this case, you can start talking about mediation and negotiation. Otherwise, with the zero-sum paradigm and framework, it's so difficult for outside or internal mediation to play a role. So to me, like realistically speaking, it's worthwhile to try to reach out to set up communication with the regime, the junta, but at the same time, it's important to be like aware that we should not raise too much expectation because the people on grounds are not ready for any type of mediation right now. So that's what we can do, how to reshape the crisis into more like conflict language rather than zero-sum game.
Thank you very much. We have an interesting question from our colleague Samir Patel, and this I think should go to Kavi. The question is, how will the crisis in Myanmar affect the situation vis-a-vis the Rohingyas?
Well,
Kavi, please unmute.
Well, thank you very much. If you notice that in all the meeting on the Myanmar crisis, in the chairman's statement, one thing they always emphasize is the crisis in the Rakhine state. ASEAN has not forgotten these challenges, and they know that in order to solve and have a durable solution to Myanmar crisis, it will be included the issue of Rohingya. But at the moment, because ASEAN has just agreed to help, it's only in the past 2 years. So a lot of groundwork must be continued. This is why in the statement of ASEAN leaders, always include Rohingya. So it will be part of the parcel with the Myanmar crisis. Thank you.
But Kavi, may I just make a comment? We studied very closely the chairman's statement and we found that the Rohingya issue paragraph is separate from the 5-point consensus, which means that when Senior General went to Jakarta, he was able to project presumed concurrence to the 5 points, which did not include the Rohingyas. So in other words, the Rohingya problem solution is going to be even pushed far into the future, right?
No, I disagree at this point because ASEAN has already started. ASEAN already have an assessment team on the ground, already have a very preliminary infrastructure there. Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore has already bilateral humanitarian aid on the ground. No, I think it has been going on. The reason why it was not including in 5-point proposal, including the release of detainer for the technical reason, you cannot have it all. So they better said that we have this 5-point. The most important point is the immediate cessation of violence. Yes.
But Dr. Myint, if I may ask one question, even the question of the release of political leaders was not included in the 5-point. Does it mean, according to your assessment, that release of prisoners will be used as a diplomatic chip by the junta? And does it also mean that the future of Madame Aung San Suu Kyi, the political future of Madame Aung San Suu Kyi, is rather dark, if I may say, in one simple word? Please unmute and tell us.
In short, ASEAN want to pay attention, like to stop killing first, right? That's the main thing. And then ASEAN want to frame this as a humanitarian emergency, and that will allow ASEAN special envoy that still need to be appointed to play a key role in coordinating with the all stakeholders. I think that the release of a political prisoner, I think, will be the immediate step when they enter the government, they enter the communication and the dialogue with the junta. So regarding Aung San Suu Kyi, I think the situation on ground is very much radicalized. I think it's going somewhat beyond what she would anticipate. So I think like her relevancy is symbolically might be still there, but in the real political war, it seems like the many younger generations are more and more radicalized and more prone to armed revolt. Whether it's feasible or not, but it's really prone to more radical action, which is different from what Aung San Suu Kyi would anticipate. Very,
very important observation. And a linked remark would be that in 1988, we knew some of the key faces of the opposition. These were the people who led the opposition movement. Unfortunately, today, it is an opposition which is without too many familiar names, familiar faces, familiar leaders. So this is both its strength and weakness. I think my last question will go to Patricia appropriately. This is coming from Mr. A. Singh. He's asking, which is bigger challenge before Myanmar, Madam, civil military crisis or the problem of ethnic reconciliation? Which is more important historically and currently? Please unmute yourself.
I think both are very important, but as I think Mr. Myint said earlier, that the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi never reached out to the ethnic minorities, and the ALD became a Burmese majority party, that I think has now come back to haunt her, because I think if it was a united stand, I don't think that the Tatmadaw would have had the kind of clout that it has today. So they really played on those weaknesses. At the same time, it's important also for the people of Myanmar to engage and ensure that they get back democracy. But how they do that is a very tall order. But I would like to say that I think India should play a more proactive role in getting together the ASEAN countries to mediate here, because I don't see anything of that sort happening. We don't hear very many discussions, at least from India. America is asserting itself every now and again. India is really very muted. So I think Ambassador Bhatia would be best able to answer that.
Well, this is not for me to answer it today, but as I said, we will have another debate, another day. This is the time, dear panelists, when I would like to invite each of you one by one to speak for a minute or so to summarize your central thesis and make any other point that I did not allow you to make earlier unwittingly. So let us begin with Kavi.
Well, I simply said that ASEAN has already started the so-called regional process, and I think other countries must give full support. United Nations G7 has already expressed very strong support of ASEAN. ASEAN has its weaknesses, and I always consider ASEAN weaknesses as strengths, because if you are too strong, nobody wants to work with you. And the fact that ASEAN is approaching Myanmar, of course, given its horrible experience that Naypyidaw has been through, we still treat each other as part of the family. So family, you have mutual promises that must be kept. So I'm waiting to see tangible result on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Minzin, please unmute.
I think the Myanmar situations, whether it's going to end up as a prolonged, intractable conflict, or if we are not lucky, there are two options, two more scenarios. One is explosion. That will have a huge spillover, effect to Thailand, India, and China. That's an explosion scenario. Another one is more like implosion. The situation will be like a lot of armed conflict will be more like urban armed insurrection and guerrilla warfare and healthcare crisis in the central Burma and central Myanmar. So that will be more implosion scenario. I think the international community somehow might prefer that implosion scenario because of the COVID and because of other geopolitical concerns. But I don't think implosion will not lead to explosion, because look at the refugee, the crisis. Even though people would think it can be contained within the Myanmar border, but it will definitely, lead to all these possible borders, India borders, into Thailand borders and China borders, because of human trafficking network, which is already in place in Myanmar. And another one is illicit war economies, including drug and gambling. The businesses will have a huge, the geo-political implication. And then the last one is the healthcare crisis. So I don't think it would be smart for the India and other international community that Myanmar conflict can be somehow contained within Myanmar border. It will not have huge, the spillover effect. But I think either implosion or explosion, it will have a huge impact on the neighboring country. So the last point is, some people may want to think that the time which when you see the intractable conflict, you have to allow a passage of time to resolve the conflict. Yeah, it's true. Sometimes you need to wait for the ripeness of the conflict. But even in this case, the time need help. I think India and other regional players can a role to help the time to accelerate so that we can get more mediation and conflict transformation in Myanmar.
Dr. Minzin, thank you. Your theory of implosion and explosion, both relating to violence. We are talking here about a country which is largely Buddhist. So let me ask you very quickly the final question on this one. What is the stand of Buddhist clergy on the possibility of implosion or explosion?
Wow, that's a very difficult question. In past 5-7 years, the Buddhist community, monk community, relationship with the Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD was not that smooth, not that very good. So I think that the Buddhist, younger generation Buddhist monk, of course, they are not happy with the military coup. They don't like that. They dislike the military coup. But at the same time, they somehow worry about that, the erosion of Buddhism or Buddhist nationalism. So I think Myanmar is somehow right now going through the modernization period. The key institution in the society, Taypyidaw, the military, and the Buddhist Sangha are under heavy pressure to transform themselves to meet the new challenges of the society. So I think that we have to wait and see how these two major institutions, Taypyidaw and the Buddhist community, could cope with the challenges of the modernization and then the post-COVID war.
Some would argue that modernization was running so beautiful from 2010 to 2020. It was happening in a progressive, peaceful manner. And now the about turn took place and it has become so painful. But thank you very much. Patricia, your final comment, please.
I will speak as a Northeasterner because we actually rely very heavily on Myanmar for the Act East policy to be operationalized. And we need a Myanmar that is free from this kind of dissension that it is facing today. Because Southeast Asia is a natural ally for us. And we are a landlocked region, which is why I think past rulers considered that we should be looking east through the Northeast. And that is our only outlet to the rest of the world, except for the 22-kilometer little narrow passage to the rest of the country. We have Bangladesh, of course. Bangladesh is a natural ally for states like Tripura and Meghalaya. But for Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, Myanmar to Thailand and the rest of the Southeast Asian countries is the route. So without a peaceful, democratic Myanmar, the Act East policy is futile. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Words with deep meaning, and I'm very happy that they were spoken by our compatriot from Northeast. Dear friends, I think we have reached very close to the conclusion of our deliberations today. You would agree that our panelists have done full justice to a whole set of questions that were put to them based on our research, our consultations, and very much our very enlightened audience. It is at this stage, it's my great pleasure and privilege to invite my colleague in Gateway House, Samir Patil, to make his closing remarks, summing up the discussion so far. Samir, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. And in fact, I echo your thoughts about the discussion. I'm sure everyone in the audience will agree that this was a very thought-provoking discussion. And in the last 72 minutes, we have covered every possible dimension of the situation in Myanmar. For the benefit of our audience, I quickly highlight 4 key takeaways from the discussion just now. First, looking at Myanmar's internal situation. Over the constitutional reforms are a result of political dynamics. Of course, the underlying reason for the coup being the military wanted to reassert its position in the country, and as well as it did it under the context of the vote fraud. Of course, another important stakeholder, as we just discussed, is the staunchly nationalist Buddhist monk community, which is closely watching the unfolding situation. At the same time, this crisis in Myanmar has economic as well as humanitarian costs, as well as the healthcare costs. Second is Myanmar's dynamics with ASEAN. Of course, there is a limited economic impact in terms of Thailand-Myanmar relations, as Dr. Kavi pointed out that the border trade has continued between the two countries. ASEAN has an interest in stable Myanmar and having Myanmar as a member of the ASEAN community, and therefore it has pressed for ending violence in the country. China is clearly watching how ASEAN is engaging with Myanmar and may step in if ASEAN falters. Looking at the external dimensions, another dimension which Dr. Myint pointed out was that the international community has reacted to what is happening in Myanmar, but clearly that response is not sufficient. Of course, it would be also misleading to look at the situation in Myanmar from the prism of US versus China angle. And finally, looking at the implications for India, which so pertinently were brought out by Patricia Mukim. Northeast shares close socio-economic and cultural relations ties with Myanmar, but it has difficulties in understanding India's diplomatic strategy when it comes to the country. Of course, there are some parts of the region which have concerns over the refugee flows, and we should also not forget the illicit flows of arms and drug smuggling, as well as the insurgent movements, which can threaten the peace in the region. Finally, India should play an active role in getting ASEAN to make peace in Myanmar. So thank you all the panelists, Dr. Kavi, Patricia Mukim, and Dr. Myint, as well as our excellent moderator, Ambassador Raju Bhatia. We are grateful to all of you for your rich insights on the subject today. And thank you to our friends from CAS and my colleagues at Gateway House. and also to the wonderful audience which really asked such relevant questions. Thank you. And we hope to see you for the next webinar in June. Till then, stay safe. Bye and have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Manzin, Patricia, Kavi, all the best to you.
Dr.
We are very
Minjin.
grateful to you.
Thank you so much.